Imagine a strip of water so narrow you could almost shout across it, and yet roughly 1 in every 10 containers shipped anywhere on Earth passes through it. That is not an exaggeration. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the tight southern gateway to the Red Sea, funnels somewhere between 10 and 12% of global seaborne trade on any given day. Oil tankers headed to Europe, container ships packed with electronics and consumer goods, and the undersea fiber optic cables carrying a massive share of the world's internet traffic. Choke that passage off, even partially, and you do not just inconvenience a few shipping executives. You send ripples through fuel prices, manufacturing supply chains, and digital infrastructure on multiple continents simultaneously. To understand why this became a crisis, picture the geography. The Red Sea runs roughly 1,400 miles from north to south, a long, narrow corridor sandwiched between the Arabian Peninsula on one side and northeastern Africa on the other. At its northern end sits the Suez Canal, the engineered shortcut connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean that has defined global trade routes since the 19th century. At its southern end is the Bab el-Mandeb, a strait barely 18 miles wide at its narrowest point, opening into the Gulf of Aden, and from there into the broader Indian Ocean. A ship traveling from Asia to Europe using this route saves roughly 7,000 miles, compared to sailing around the southern tip of Africa. That efficiency is not just convenient. For time-sensitive cargo and fuel-cost-conscious operators, it is the entire economic logic of the route. When that logic breaks down, the consequences are immediate and global. That breakdown began in earnest in late 2023. Yemen's Houthi movement, operating from territory in the country's north and west, launched what would become a sustained and increasingly sophisticated campaign of attacks against commercial and naval vessels transiting the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The weapons were not improvised. The Houthis deployed anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, one-way attack drones, and small boat harassment tactics, a layered threat package that reflected significant outside assistance. They framed their campaign as retaliation, claiming to target shipping linked to Israel, the United States, or the United Kingdom in response to the conflict in Gaza. In practice, however, the targeting was far from precise. Vessels with no conceivable connection to any of those parties found themselves under threat, and the broader effect was a wave of fear and uncertainty that spread across international shipping regardless of flag, cargo, or ownership. Washington's calculation was straightforward, even if the response would prove anything but simple. Freedom of navigation in international waters is not just a principle the United States defends rhetorically. It is a cornerstone of the global order that American military power has underwritten for decades. Allowing a regional militia, however well armed, to effectively hold one of the world's most important trade arteries at risk was not something the Pentagon or the White House was willing to accept as a new baseline. Beyond the strategic principle, there were concrete economic stakes. Supply chains still fragile from the disruptions of the early 2020s could not absorb another sustained shock without real consequences for inflation, manufacturing, and consumer prices across the developed world and beyond. On December 18, 2023, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin announced the formation of Operation Prosperity Guardian, a U.S.-led multinational naval security initiative structured under Combined Maritime Forces. Task Force 153, an existing framework built specifically for Red Sea maritime security. This was not a unilateral American declaration of war on the Houthis. It was a coalition effort, and that distinction matters. The United Kingdom contributed HMS Diamond and other assets. Denmark, and home to Maersk, one of the world's largest container shipping companies and one of the most directly affected, joined the effort. Other NATO partners and allied nations signed on as well, reflecting a shared recognition that the threat was to everyone's commerce, not just American interests. The wall of warships being assembled in the Red Sea was multinational by design, even if U.S. assets formed its backbone and American command structures led the operational picture. Sitting behind all of this, providing the missiles, the drones, the targeting sensors, and the political backing that made the Houthi campaign possible, was Iran. U.S. forces in January 2024 intercepted a shipment of components for unmanned surface and underwater vehicles traced back to Iran and bound for Houthi-controlled Yemen, and adding hard evidence to what intelligence assessments had long suggested. Tehran's relationship with the Houthis is best understood not as direct command and control. Iran officially denies giving operational orders, and the precise chain of authority is partly classified and genuinely disputed, but as deep material sponsorship combined with strategic alignment. Iran supplies the hardware and the know-how. The Houthis supply the manpower and the willingness to use it. Iran also made its own symbolic move in early January 2024, deploying the frigate Alborz to the Red Sea. Tehran framed this as a response to U.S. and allied naval operations, and as an expression of solidarity with what it calls the resistance axis. And analysts were careful not to overstate the military significance of the Alborz. Iran's conventional navy is a modest force compared to what the U.S. had assembled, but the deployment carried a message. Iran wanted to signal presence, contest the U.S. narrative, and remind the region that it considered these waters part of its strategic sphere of influence. Whether Tehran accurately anticipated the speed and scale of the U.S. and allied response is a question analysts continue to debate, and any claim about Iran's internal calculations should be treated as an assessment rather than a proven fact. What does seem clear, in retrospect, is that the coalition that coalesced under Operation Prosperity Guardian was larger, faster, and more operationally engaged than a simple show of force. It was the beginning of something that would test the limits of naval power against asymmetric threats in some of the most strategically loaded waters on the planet. And understanding why that wall of warships was built, the geography, the economics, the escalation chain that ran from Houthi launch sites back to Iranian weapons depots, is essential before asking what it could actually do. So, what did that wall of warships actually look like in practice, and what could it realistically accomplish? The centerpiece was the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Nimitz-class nuclear carrier and one of the most powerful conventional military platforms on the planet. Built around her was Carrier Strike Group 2, Carrier Air Wing 3, with dozens of aircraft capable of everything from long-range precision strikes to close air support. The guided missile cruiser USS Philippine Sea, packing an extensive magazine of surface-to-air missiles and Tomahawks, and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including USS Gravely and USS Mason, warships whose Aegis combat systems and standard missile batteries are specifically designed to track and destroy exactly the kinds of threats the Houthis were throwing at the corridor. This force operated across an enormous stretch of water, shifting between the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the northern Arabian Sea as the operational picture demanded. The idea was not to hold one fixed line, but to create overlapping defensive layers, ship-based long-range missile intercepts as the outer ring, close-in weapons systems as a final backstop, and carrier air power as the offensive arm capable of reaching back into Yemen itself. The engagements that resulted from this deployment were relentless. U.S. ships and aircraft conducted repeated intercepts of inbound drones and anti-ship missiles, often multiple times within a single operational day. The tempo was unlike anything American carrier aviation had experienced since the Gulf War era. One moment that captured the intensity better than almost any other came on January 30, 2024, when USS Gravely used her Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-guided 20mm rotary cannon designed as a last-ditch defense to destroy an anti-ship cruise missile. When a warship is firing its CIWS, the threat has already penetrated every outer layer of defense and is seconds from impact. That is not a comfortable margin. It illustrates precisely how close and how fast these engagements were unfolding, and it was not an isolated incident. Beyond the defensive intercepts, carrier-based aircraft and surface-launched weapons struck Houthi targets inside Yemen, launch sites for missiles and drones, radar installations used to target shipping, and storage facilities holding the munitions stockpiles that kept the campaign going. These were not symbolic pinpricks. By the time the Eisenhower's deployment concluded, her strike group had expended roughly 770 weapons, a figure that includes air-to-air missiles, precision-guided bombs, and standoff weapons. U.S. Navy commanders described the deployment as historically intense, and analysts began drawing comparisons to the 1980s tanker war, when the United States found itself in a grinding, asymmetric maritime contest in confined Gulf waters against Iranian mining and missile tactics. The parallel is uncomfortable but accurate. Then, as now, the challenge was not defeating a peer adversary in a conventional engagement. It was absorbing an unrelenting stream of relatively cheap threats without exhausting expensive warships and munitions in the process. And that reveals the central tension in what this naval wall could actually do. Every Standard missile intercepting a Houthi drone costs somewhere in the range of $1 million or more. The drones themselves cost a fraction of that. The math is not favorable for the defender when the attacker can sustain a high rate of fire indefinitely. The coalition could protect specific high-value vessels it was directly escorting, and it could suppress Houthi launch capacity through strikes on infrastructure, but it could not be everywhere at once in a body of water stretching hundreds of miles, and it could not eliminate the threat entirely without a ground campaign inside Yemen that nobody was prepared to undertake. Merchant crews continued to face danger, ships were hit, people died, and the broader deterrent effect, while real, was incomplete. The clearest evidence of those limits came from the commercial sector itself. Maersk, the Danish shipping giant and one of the world's largest container carriers, temporarily halted Red Sea and Suez transits in early 2024 and rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. That is roughly 3,500 additional miles per voyage, adding weeks to transit times and significant costs to supply chains already under pressure. When one of the most commercially vital shipping lanes on Earth is being bypassed by the industry's largest operators, despite the presence of a carrier strike group, it is a frank assessment of risk tolerance from people whose business depends on accurate calculations. The naval wall reduced the threat. It did not eliminate it. Iran's role in all of this reflects a strategic logic that is asymmetric almost by design. Tehran is not trying to defeat the U.S. Navy in a conventional engagement, a goal that would be plainly beyond the capacity of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or the conventional Iranian fleet, whose symbolic deployment of the frigate Alborz was noted but not feared by coalition commanders. Iran's approach is to use proxy pressure, cheap weapons, and sustained attrition to impose costs on Western commercial and military interests without crossing a threshold that would trigger a direct response against Iranian territory. It is calibrated, patient, and, in many respects, cost-effective. What analysts assess, and it is worth emphasizing this as an assessment, not a proven internal Iranian calculation, is that Tehran may have underestimated how quickly the United States and its allies would mass a credible and operationally aggressive maritime response. Operation Prosperity Guardian was not a hesitant patrol. It was a sustained, high-tempo combat deployment, and the 770 weapons figure alone signals that Washington accepted the costs of genuine engagement rather than symbolic presence. The broader takeaway from this deployment is not that naval power failed. The strike group protected significant amounts of shipping and imposed real costs on Houthi launch capacity. The takeaway is that we are in the middle of an unresolved contest over a fundamental question. Can missiles and drones, wielded by a well-supplied proxy force, intimidate global trade, even in the face of overwhelming conventional naval power? The answer, at least through the first half of 2024, is that they can cause serious disruption even if they cannot close the sea lanes entirely. That is a dangerous and unstable equilibrium, and it has no clean resolution on the horizon. The Red Sea standoff is still evolving. If you want to follow the next major shift, whether that's a change in coalition posture, an escalation involving Iran directly, or a breakthrough that finally restores confidence to the shipping lanes, subscribe and hit the bell. This story is far from over.